Sometimes, in life, the world doesn't hand us sunshine when we want it. Sometimes, it throws a Monday morning with grey clouds, a ticking clock, and an angry boss with steam practically shooting out of his ears. But how we respond, that's the game. And in a small American office park, where the coffee machine whirred louder than ambition and cubicles stood like beige walls of both hope and despair, a story was unfolding. A story about anger, and about smiling through it. It was a chilly spring morning in Oakridge, Ohio, one of those towns where you could still hear birds louder than traffic, and where the American flag waved on porches with a little more pride than in the big city. The houses were mostly two-story, vinyl-sided, with basketball hoops over driveways and kids' bikes tipped over on lawns still wet with dew. Pickup trucks and sedans lined the streets, most with faded bumper stickers, some political, some just announcing allegiance to the local high school football team. The sky was pale blue, half smeared with clouds that threatened rain later in the day. The wind carried the smell of fresh-cut grass, because in towns like Oakridge, lawns weren't just lawns, they were competitions between neighbors. Inside Oakridge Business Park, a boxy two-story building with reflective windows that made it look fancier than it actually was, the day was beginning like every other Monday. Workers filed in wearing everything from button-downs tucked into khakis to polo shirts paired with jeans. A few had ties, the ambitious ones. Most carried Starbucks cups, some had gas station coffees in styrofoam. Sneakers squeaked on the polished floor, conversations hummed, and the occasional chuckle broke through the morning groans. At the center of it all was Anderson Holt Consulting, a mid-sized firm that did a lot of everything but was famous for nothing. The walls inside the office were painted off-white, decorated with motivational posters from the early 2000s that no one really read anymore, things like, "Teamwork makes the dream work," with stock photos of people high-fiving. And in this setting, two personalities stood out. One was the boss, a man named Mr. Charles Whitman, short-tempered, sharp-dressed, and quick to raise his voice. The kind of man whose veins popped when things weren't perfect. And the other was an employee, Jake Miller, a young man in his late 20s, who, no matter how many storms brewed around him, carried a smile that refused to quit. Today, those two were about to clash. But what happened in that clash would change not only a Monday morning, but maybe how people thought about pressure, anger, and the power of a grin. Jake Miller rolled into the office at 8:47 a.m. Technically, work started at 8:30. But Jake wasn't the kind of guy who pretended life was a military drill. He wore a light blue shirt tucked into slightly wrinkled khakis, his sneakers were clean but not polished, and his hair looked like he'd styled it with the wind from driving with his car windows down. In one hand, he held a Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee the size of a small fire extinguisher. In the other, a bag with 2 glazed donuts. Susan, a patient woman in her 40s with glasses sliding down her nose, gave a diplomatic nod. "Yes, Mr. Whitman, I'll remind him." But she didn't have to. Charles stormed out of his office, his polished shoes clacking like a metronome of fury. The whole office went silent, heads peeking above cubicle walls like prairie dogs spotting a hawk. And here it was. The storm was about to meet the sunshine. The boss with a thundercloud on his face, and the employee with a smile on his lips. One man boiling over, the other carrying iced coffee and glazed donuts as if they were shields against life's battles. Charles stopped right in front of Jake's cubicle. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Jake, my office, now." Jake looked up, smile still plastered across his face, and took another casual sip of iced coffee. "Sure thing, boss. But do you want a donut first? Might help soften the edges." The entire office froze. Some gasped. Linda nearly dropped her stapler. Offering Charles Whitman a donut in the middle of his fury was like offering a cat a bath. But Jake, unfazed, stood up, brushed powdered sugar from his khakis, and followed Charles into the corner office. Charles slammed the office door shut. The blinds rattled. He turned, pointing a finger so stiff it could have been carved from wood. "Do you think this is a game, Miller?" Charles barked. "Do you think this company runs on jokes, coffee, and that ridiculous grin of yours? You were late. Again. And the client report you were supposed to finalize, it isn't on my desk." Jake leaned against the chair in front of the desk, calm as ever. His grin wasn't forced, wasn't smug, it was easy. Like he'd just remembered something funny about life. "Mr. Whitman, with all due respect," Jake said, "I'd rather run on coffee and smiles than ulcers and Advil." Charles's face turned a shade of crimson that matched his tie. His jaw clenched. But Jake kept talking, his voice steady, almost conversational. "You ever notice how when we walk in here, everyone looks like they're carrying invisible weights? People come in with their coffee like it's life support, sigh at their computers, and just grind through the day. Me, I figure if I've got to be here, I might as well lighten the air a little. Smile through it. Otherwise, we're just existing, not living." Charles's hand slammed the desk. "This is a business, Jake. A professional environment. Your attitude may amuse the others, but it undermines discipline. It undermines me." Jake tilted his head, sipping his iced coffee again. "Or maybe it lifts them, boss. Ever think about that?" And in that office, something shifted. The storm was still raging, but the sunshine wasn't backing down. This wasn't defiance, it was perspective. Because sometimes, when anger meets calmness, when fury meets laughter, the real question isn't about lateness or donuts. Anger can fill a room like smoke. Thick, suffocating, but a smile, sometimes it's the open window. And that morning in Oakridge, as Charles Whitman's fury pounded against the walls of his office, Jake Miller's grin refused to fade. The question was, would that grin be a match for decades of tension, discipline, and the American? Charles paced in front of his desk like a caged lion. His fists clenched, his breath heavy, his voice booming. I don't need comedy in this office, Miller. I need reliability, punctuality, professionalism. Jake stayed seated, leaning back in the chair like it was his living room recliner, iced coffee sweating in his hand. He tapped his sneaker against the carpet and tilted his head, studying Charles with a calm amusement. You know, boss, Jake said, you've got the best suit game in Oakridge. I swear, if there was a fashion show at the high school gym tonight, you'd sweep every category. Charles blinked. For a moment, his anger cracked, not fully, but just enough for confusion to slip in. This isn't a joke, Charles snapped, his finger stabbing the air. Jake raised his cup in a mock toast. It's not. I'm serious. People here notice the way you carry yourself. But here's the thing, boss, nobody notices your shoes if you're stomping too hard. And just like that, Jake wasn't joking anymore. He was teaching, not in a lecture, but in the rhythm of casual words. Because sometimes wisdom wears sneakers and carries iced coffee. And sometimes anger only softens when it sees itself in the mirror of truth. Charles froze mid-pace, his eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Jake leaned forward now, resting his elbows on his knees, his grin softer, gentler. Boss, people respect you, no doubt. You're sharp, you're smart, you demand a lot. But when you walk through here angry, it doesn't just land on me. It lands on Linda in her floral blouse, on Susan at her desk, on the interns who are already sweating bullets trying to figure out the copy machine. Your storm spreads. And sure, I crack jokes, I smile, I ease the weight. But what if you, just once, showed him the side that isn't all lightning? Charles's jaw tightened. He sat behind his desk, silent, stretching like an invisible rope. Outside the glass walls, workers pretended to type but their ears were glued to the drama. In American offices, bosses were often painted as either drill sergeants or cheerleaders. Rarely both, and Charles Whitman had always been the former. He was old school, work hard, suffer through, climb the ladder, retire before your heart gave out. But Jake was part of a new wave. The generation that wore sneakers with suits, cracked jokes in emails, and believed a smile wasn't weakness but strategy. Their clash was bigger than just boss versus employee, it was tradition versus change. Charles finally spoke, voice lower now. You think smiling fixes everything, Miller? You think life is just donuts and positivity? Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Nope, but it makes the punches softer. Look, boss, life's gonna swing at us anyway. Deadlines, angry clients, bills, traffic jams, grocery prices going through the roof. We can't stop the hits, but we can decide if we meet them with a scowl or with a grin. And I'll tell you, grinning hurts a lot less. For the first time, Charles leaned back, loosening his tie slightly. His eyes flicked to the blinds, to the faint reflection of himself in the glass. He looked tired, not just angry, but tired. Years of pressure weighed in the bags under his eyes. His hand ran through his slicked back hair, messing it just enough to look human again. You know, Miller, Charles muttered, when I started in this business, my first boss told me, smile too much and they'll walk all over you. I guess I believed him. Jake leaned back with a grin. Sounds like your boss needed a donut. Charles almost smirked. Outside, the workers could hear the muffled voices, but suddenly, laughter, Charles's laughter, broke through the glass walls. It was short, rusty, like an old engine coughing to life, but it was there. Heads popped up over cubicles again. Linda clutched her pearls. Susan dropped her pen. Did the boss just laugh? Whispered Mark, a junior analyst in plaid. No way, Linda hissed. That man hasn't laughed since gas was under $2. The rumor traveled faster than a TikTok trend. The entire floor buzzed. Because in America's cubicle farms, gossip moves like electricity. And laughter, especially from a boss like Charles Whitman, wasn't just rare, it was newsworthy. Some people typed emails faster, pretending to work. Others leaned back, ears wide open. And for a moment, productivity took a backseat to curiosity. What was happening in the lion's den? Back inside, Charles shook his head, still smiling faintly. You're something else, Miller. You're late, undisciplined, constantly cracking jokes. And yet, he paused. You might be the only person in this office who actually enjoys being here. Jake shrugged. Someone's got to balance out the ulcers. The storm in Charles was gone now, replaced with something different, thought. Reflection. He glanced at the pile of papers on his desk, the endless charts, the emails pinging on his computer. his kingdom of stress. And across from him sat a guy in wrinkled khakis, eating donuts and grinning, yet somehow winning the battle. "All right, Miller," Charles finally said. "Get me that report by noon. And try being on time tomorrow." Jake stood, saluting playfully. "Yes, sir, but tomorrow, I'm bringing you coffee. Your choice, black, 2 sugars, or with a smile." Charles chuckled again, this time louder. "Get out of here before I change my mind." Jake walked out, still smiling, donut bag in hand. The entire office stared at him as if he'd just performed an exorcism. And just like that, the storm had passed. The boss wasn't a saint, the employee wasn't a hero. But in the collision of anger and positivity, something new had been born. A balance, a reminder that leadership doesn't always roar, sometimes it smiles. And as word spread around Oakridge Business Park, something unexpected happened. The office itself changed. The following Monday, Oakridge woke to a grey drizzle. The sky hung heavy, puddles gathered on driveways, and kids in raincoats splashed their way to the bus stop. At Anderson Holt Consulting, umbrellas dripped in the lobby, wet shoes squeaked across the tiles, and everyone braced for another typical Monday. But something was different. Charles walked in at 8:15, suit sharp, shoes polished as always. But this time, as he passed Linda's desk, he paused. "Good morning, Linda. New blouse?" he asked, actually smiling. Linda nearly fell out of her chair. "Ah, yes, Mr. Whitman. Thank you." Down the hall, Charles passed Susan. "Susan, you handled the client call last week. Excellent job." Susan almost dropped her coffee. "Thank you, sir." And then, as he entered his office, Charles spotted Jake. The young man was, predictably, 3 minutes late, iced coffee in hand, sneakers squeaking. Charles shook his head, but instead of barking, he said, "Miller, you're buying donuts for the whole office this Friday." Jake grinned. "On it, boss." And so it was. The angry boss hadn't become a comedian overnight, and Jake hadn't turned into Mr. Perfect Punctual. But the office felt different now. Lighter, because one man dared to keep smiling when the storm raged. And another dared, finally, to let that smile in. In Oakridge, Ohio, where the sky was often gray and the work never ended, people learned something simple but profound. You can't always control the weather. You can't always control your boss, your coworkers, or the pile of work on your desk. But you can control your face. And sometimes, controlling your face, choosing a smile, changes everything else. So, the next time the world comes at you with anger, deadlines, or disappointment, remember Jake Miller and his iced coffee grin. Smile anyway, not because life is perfect, but because it isn't. And that's exactly why it needs your smile.
Like and subscribe if you want daily dose of happiness and motivation.